Agitorium nostrum in nomine Domini.
We bet each other.
All right, this is church history. We're looking at the Arian crisis in the early church. It was already condemned in what year? The Arian heresy. What year and what council?
325?
Down in 325 AD.
325, what council?
The Council of Nicaea.
Yes, but Arius dies. He blows up with worms in his intestines. He explodes, a terrible death for Arius, a priest. But the heresies continued through these bishops who were friends of Arius and believed his heresies. Namely,
Bishop Eusebius of Nicomedia, others.
yes, a whole party of them. And it spread so badly that, like an infection or cancer in the body, the whole body was diseased by Arian heresy. St. Athanasius so now he had to flee to exile, and he wrote numerous books while in exile for 6 years with the monks of the Thebaid on the Nile River. His first plan on reaching the desert was to go and appeal to Constantius in person, as he had appealed to his father. So remember, St. Athanasius talked to Constantine, his father. And he's already met with Constantius once. Constantius, the emperor, made all these promises, but he reneged on them because he was persuaded by who?
Eusebius.
To go against Athanasius again. Yeah, Bishop Eusebius and the other Arian bishops. Plus, they succeeded to get the Pope they rattled him up and beat him up and threatened this and threatened that. So out of weakness, Pope Liberius signed a heretical document. He did sign it. So were there sedevacantists back then who said, well, he signed this heretical document, so he's not Pope anymore?
No.
Did that exist?
No.
Nobody even questioned it. Yes, he signed it. It was through weakness. We could say the same with these modernist popes. Through weakness, they went with modernism. Because what do you expect when Pope John Paul II and Benedict XVI go to high school and they're taught modernism? They go to the seminary and they're taught modernism. And all their theology is modernist. What do you expect but a modernist pope? So does that take away the papacy if he's validly elected? Well, not necessarily. And you have this example with Pope Liberius. He did sign the Semi-Arian Creed. It was a heretical document. You say what you want about he was threatened, he was bribed, he was beaten up or whatever. He signed it. But he still remained Pope of the Roman Catholic Church. And he's also the first Pope not canonized. So it's very possible all these last 5 popes will be condemned as well, even though they were popes. All right, so he's hoping to meet with the Emperor Constantius. He could not believe that the emperor had deliberately broken his oaths at Antioch 10 years before, when he learned how he had been deceived by Bishop Eusebius and the rest. Constantius would no doubt disown all the treachery and violence done in his name at Alexandria. St. Athanasius carefully drew up a long defense to present to him, answering all the charges that his enemies had made against him. He set off with it across the Libyan desert, intending thence to take a boat for Italy and to find the emperor at Milan. Milan is northern Italy. On the way, he heard of the banishment of the Nicene bishops. What's the Nicene bishops?
Bishops who were
At the Council of Nicaea?
Exactly. These were all the great, Catholic, traditional Catholic bishops. They're the ones that, like at Vatican II, they were the traditional bishops who defended the faith. And there was only about 250 of them. And among them, and in fact, one of the leaders among them was Archbishop Lefebvre. So if ever you go to St. Peter's in Rome, when you enter, try to enter at least or leave through one of the doors on the left side. Not in the dead center, but on the left. I forget which one, the far left or the next one in. And look up on the wall and you'll see names of bishops who were at Vatican II. And you'll see up in there Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre, Archbishop of Toul in France. You'll see his name up there. So maybe someday they'll paint those letters in gold, most likely. On the way, St. Athanasius heard of the banishment of the Nicene bishops. These were the good traditional bishops defending the faith, including Osius of Cordoba after the Council of Milan. So this council took place with the Arian bishops and Constantius backing it, and they banished the good bishops. Further on, he heard that 16 Egyptian bishops had been exiled, and that the troops of Syrianus had stormed the churches of Alexandria on Easter Sunday, killing and wounding many. After Easter, the Emperor Constantius had sent a new governor, Heraclius, with letters to the pagans threatening them with severe penalties if they did not attack the Catholics.
Whoa.
So he's obliging them to attack those who profess Christ as God. So that's Heraclius, a very popular ancient name, Heraclius. This threat, however, failed, for St. Athanasius had become so popular with all sorts of persons since his previous exile that only the ragtag and bobtail of the heathen took up the cry. So only the lowlife of Alexandria took up the deal to persecute the Catholics. If any further evidence of the emperor's perfidy were needed, perfidy meaning denying the faith, rejecting the faith, it finally reached the hands of the exile St. Athanasius in the form of copies of Constantius's letters denouncing him to the Alexandrians as, quote, the wicked Athanasius, commending the venerable George as their new bishop, and ordering the churches turned over to the Arians. St. Athanasius now saw the futility of appealing to a man who had broken his most solemn oaths. He went back to the desert to write his History of the Arians with its famous denunciation of the Emperor Constantius. So Constantius was a traitor to his own words and oaths. He persecutes the Catholics, and now he's calling Athanasius wicked, and he's praising the Arian heretics. So much for relying on the two-facedness of Constantius. This was quite different in tone from the Apologia to Constantius, which St. Athanasius had hoped to present at Milan. In that document, he had naturally adopted the most charitable, respectful, in fact rather ingratiating attitude. He had called the emperor most religious Augustus, quote, most gracious Augustus, quote, Augustus most beloved and beloved of God, and had added, quote, thanks be to the Lord who has given you the kingdom. All men are confirmed in their opinion of your goodness. So he's very respectful to the emperor. Like Archbishop Lefebvre was always respectful to these modernist popes and to the bishops who tried to hang him if they could. Then surely he was giving Constantius, the emperor, the benefit of the doubt. But now, having found him out who he really is, he could hardly find expression too harsh for him. He was worse than Saul, Ahab, and Pilate. There was no precedent for his wickedness. Here's a quote from the writings of Archbishop Bishop St. Athanasius. Quote, Zenobia was a Jewess, and a supporter of Paul of Samosata, Bishop Paul. But she did not give up the churches to the Jews for synagogues. This is a new piece of iniquity. It is not simply persecution, but more than persecution. It is a prelude in preparation for the coming of the Antichrist. Close quote, St. Athanasius. What would you say now when most of the Catholic churches have been hijacked for the new conciliar religion? And we're having Mass in homes, hotels, basements, garages, you name it. You talk about a preparation for the coming of the Antichrist. We're in it. The Emperor Constantius was a despot, a tyrant, and a hypocrite who had surrounded himself with eunuchs. So he has all these men around him with high voices and female faces. Quote, "It was the eunuchs who instigated these proceedings against all," he declared. And the quote, "and the most remarkable circumstance in the matter is this, that the Arian heresy, which denies the Son of God," writes St. Athanasius, "receives its support from eunuchs." A bunch of wimps, a bunch of flowers with 2 legs and arms, and probably a bunch of them lisping. Yeah, isn't that modernist Rome today? All these perverts who back the rainbow flag movement and receive these perverted couples coming to visit the Pope, and he kisses them. He kisses them like they're best friends. So birds of a feather flock together. Archbishop Vigano speaks of the pink mafia in Rome. The pink mafia. They have such power now in Rome. This whole network of perverts. And Bishop Vigano exposed them even by name, and that was correct to do. Just like Archbishop Lefebvre exposed the modernists of 45 years ago. By name. Cardinal Ratzinger, Bishop Cardinal Casaroli, etc. Bonini. So here Constantius is surrounded himself with all these effeminate men called eunuchs. He writes, "And the most remarkable circumstance in the matter is this, that the Arian heresy, which denies the Son of God, receives its support from eunuchs, who, as both their bodies are fruitless and their souls barren of virtue, cannot bear even to hear the name of Son. The eunuch of Ethiopia, indeed, though he understood not what he read, believed the words of St. Philip." He's referring to Acts of the Apostles. Remember, the eunuch was traveling in the carriage. St. Philip ran up to the carriage and said, "What are you reading?" And the eunuch from Ethiopia, probably a black guy, he said, "I'm reading Isaiah, but I can't make any sense of it. Do you want me to explain it to you?" "Yeah, jump in, tell me." So he jumps in, tells him, explains, and it's the passage. Anybody remember what passage?
Was it with regards to Christ's passion?
Yes. Christ compared to the Isaiah 53.
To the Lamb?
To the Lamb who would be
Led to the slaughter?
led to the slaughter and opened not his mouth. That was Christ. And St. Philip the Apostle explained Isaiah was speaking of Christ. And I know his mother. And his mother is a virgin. And Isaiah says right here in chapter 7, "Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and his name will be called Emmanuel, God with us." So he would explain all this to him. And the Ethiopian converted. He said, "Well, what am I waiting for? Can you baptize me?" And St. Philip did. Stopped the carriage and he was baptized. So this is what St. Athanasius is referring to in this next part of the letter. "So the eunuch of Ethiopia, indeed, though he understood not what he read, believed the words of St. Philip when he taught him concerning the Savior. But the eunuchs of Constantius cannot endure the confession of Peter. Nay, they turn away when the Father manifests the Son, and madly rage against those who say that the Son of God is his genuine Son, thus claiming as a heresy of eunuchs that there is no genuine and true offspring of the Father. Unquote. So St. Athanasius is saying, just like eunuchs cannot have children, so they deny that God the Son is the only begotten Son of the Father. Constantius the Emperor had all the qualities of the Antichrist. He was, to quote St. Athanasius in the History of Arians again, Constantius was the most wicked of all the persecutors of the Church of Christ. Unquote. Altogether, the History of Arians, in which St. Athanasius warned Catholics against the duplicity and cruelty of the ruler of the world, was one of the most fiery documents of that violent age and one of the most devastating denunciations in all history. And we could compare that to Archbishop Lefebvre's work, They Have Uncrowned Him, which exposes all the modernists in Rome, the purpose of Vatican II, which was destruction of the faith, and the New Mass, its bastard right daughter of Vatican II, trying to marry the Catholic Church with the Revolution, bringing forth an adulterous, illegitimate child called the New Mass. Archbishop Lefebvre also wrote another book called Open Letter to Confused Catholics. Have you read that?
Yes. I haven't read it all yet.
Okay, so you're going to have to read that, and you're going to have to write summaries on each chapter, as you're doing now with
Spiritual journey.
yes. So in that, Archbishop Lefebvre denounces the modernists, like St. Athanasius. He had to denounce, and by name. That's why a lot of people, the liberals get upset with the Catholic resistance. Oh, you shouldn't be naming Bishop Williamson when he teaches these errors. You shouldn't be naming Bishop Fillet by name. You shouldn't be naming the liberals. Well, you have to point out the wolf. That's the way it is. May God rest the good soul of Bishop Williamson. He knows now all about the New Mass and its destruction, that he was wrong to promote New Mass miracles. He knows now for sure. But keep praying for his soul. Yet Arianism was already beginning to go the way of all heresies. Such movements are negative, they have no creative vitality, and thrive only on opposition. As soon as they are free to do as they please and are no longer parties of protest against the eternal thing, capital T, they hate, they wither away and die. It had been so of the Simonians, it would be so of the Calvinists, so it was now of the Arian heretics. And although in other countries they would do much mischief for a century or two to come, they had passed the zenith of their influence in Egypt. So by the summer of 358 AD, the intrusive George, the false bishop, had made himself so unpopular that the people of Alexandria rose up against him and all but killed him as he fled. This is what the Catholics should have done to all these modernist bishops. Drive them out of town. They drove his followers also out of the churches. And when Bishop George ventured to return 3 years later, they threw him into chains and finally lynched him. So the Catholics had enough of this wicked Bishop George. Constantius the Emperor also was mortal. As he hurried from Antioch towards the Persian border to oppose the eastward march of his cousin and his rival, Julian, which would be Julian the Apostate, Constantius got sick, caught a fever, and on November 3rd, 361, after being baptized by the Arian bishop Euzoius at Mopsukrene, under Mount Taurus, he died at the age of 45. So Constantius dies in 361, 45 years old, and he dies an Arian heretic. Now, Julian the Apostate. This is a chapter of horror under his reign. He will unleash a terrible persecution on the church. He will put to death many, many priests and bishops and laity. Julian the Apostate was now the master of the world. Since boyhood, he had hated Christianity because he blamed it unreasonably for the murder of his relatives after Constantine's death, and because he had been secretly prejudiced against it by his tutors, his teachers, the eunuch, here's another eunuch, the eunuch Mardonius and the pagan philosopher Nicocles. Idealistic and religious by nature, he became immersed in Neoplatonism and in all sorts of superstitious magic at Nicomedia in 350 AD. 5 years later, having won the favor of the Empress Eusebia, he was allowed to study at Athens in Greece, where he completely surrendered to the dark impulse to attempt to wrest secrets from God and nature by magic. And he was initiated into the obscure fellowship of the Eleusinian mysteries. So these are all pagan rituals. As soon as he became emperor on the death of Constantius, he threw off all pretense of Christianity. He openly proclaimed himself Pontifex Maximus of Zeus and Helios, the sun god. So he was the living image of Zeus and Helios, the sun god. So he was really in La La Land. He ordered the resumption of worship in the pagan temples. He forbade the teaching of rhetoric or grammar by Christians. Finally, he revealed himself as the champion of Judaism against the Catholic Church. So he was the one that tried to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem, but God stepped in, sending earthquakes, lightning bolts, and so forth, right? Remember that?
Yes.
Julian, it was bad news. It's not in this book, but there's the famous case of Saint Basil of Ancyra, who was a holy priest, Father Saint Basil of Ancyra, who was tortured by order of Julian the Apostate. They flogged him so badly, his flesh and skin were just hanging off in clumps. And when they dragged him before the emperor said, "Have you had enough now? Are you going to burn incense?" And Father Basil of Ancyra, he took off a chunk of flesh hanging off his arm, threw it at the emperor, Julian the Apostate, and said, "Is that all you have? Is that all the torture you're going to give me? You'll never make me renounce the Catholic faith. Never. Bring more tortures." And that infuriated Julian the Apostate, and he added more tortures, and finally, I think he was beheaded. So Julian the Emperor, Julian the Apostate, hated Christ. He also hated the memory of his cousin, Constantius. True, Constantius was an Arian heretic and not a true Christian, and the Arians generally, by their friendliness to Jews and aversion to Catholics, tended to confirm the opinion of St. Athanasius that they were essentially Judaizers. So every heresy has a strand of Judaism, always. So there's a picture you'll see, I showed you yesterday. Putin is sitting there surrounded by all these Jews. Trump is sitting there in the Oval Office surrounded by all these Jews. And Zelensky is sitting there surrounded by all these Jews, rabbis and whatever. And who's the real influence in the world in politics?
The Jews.
It is. You have to state the fact. And they're proud of it. They don't hide it. They boast about it. And they're openly saying, we got to submit the Goyim and get rid of them and destroy nations by this invasion of Europe by these so-called immigrants. It's a true invasion to destroy Catholic civilization. What's left? So Julian the Apostate was heavily tied in with the synagogue of Satan. Interesting, isn't it? The Emperor Constantius was an exception, however. He hated Jews and persecuted them. This alone would have been enough to align the new emperor on the side of the dispersed. It hardly explains, however, the length to which he went. There may be some truth in Graetz's conjecture that he needed the support of the powerful Babylonian Jewry for the Persian wars. It may also be that some of the secret magical lore he had learned at Eleusis encouraged him to undertake a project which, by a curious coincidence, was to appear among the ritualistic hopes of secret societies in later times. Freemasonry. At all events, Julian the Apostate announced his intention to rebuild the temple at Jerusalem. He told the Jews that he had read in books of magic that the time had come for them to return and establish the kingdom of God in their city. He promised to make his capital there in Jerusalem after his victory in Persia. So everything Julian the Apostate wanted to do, Trump has already done. So what does that tell you? And it's very fishy, isn't it? As an evidence of his sincerity, he freed them from all taxes, so the Jews didn't have to pay any taxes, asked for their prayers, and sent a horde of workmen to Jerusalem, a Christian city since the conversion of Constantine, to clear away the ruins to begin the construction of the temple. Nothing since Bar Kokhba's war had so kindled the hopes of Jewish exiles scattered throughout the world. With pathetic devotion, they flocked from afar to Jerusalem as of old, offering their money and their goods to help defray the expense of the restoration, while Jewish women, with the greatest joy, donated all their ornaments and even toiled with their men among the ruins, carrying dirt and stones for the new foundations. In their exuberance, many of the dispersed went so far as to burn Catholic churches in various parts of the empire. 2 churches burnt at Damascus, others at Gaza, Ascalon, and Beirut. The beautiful basilica of St. Athanasius at Alexandria was burned. Sounds like Canada burning their churches, doesn't it? And in France, Muslims burning the churches. Yet all this expenditure of labor, wealth, and enthusiasm proved futile and vain. God stepped in. Repeated earthquakes, followed by flames shooting from the earth, compelled the workers to cease after many had been crushed or scorched. And when at last the crowds were terrified by the appearance in the sky at evening of a luminous cross surrounded by a circle, even Julian the Apostate admitted defeat and abandoned the project. So God was not well pleased with their trying to rebuild the temple. And here's a footnote here. Look on thy God, Christ hidden in our flesh, a bitter word, the cross, in bitter sight, hard rind without to hold the heart of heaven. Anyway, okay. To St. Athanasius, as to the badgered Jews, the accession of Julian seemed at first a piece of good fortune. For one of the apostate's first acts was to order the return of all bishops exiled by the hated Emperor Constantius. Thus, after 6 years, the wanderer, St. Athanasius, returned once again to Alexandria early in the year 362. 362, St. Athanasius returns after his second exile. Remember, he has 5. Amid scenes of touching joy and devotion. And on this occasion, the little bishop demonstrated that if he could be fierce and unyielding in battle, he could bring the calmer gifts of a statesman to the task of restoring unity and peace. He promptly convoked a synod whose orthodox yet moderately stated resolutions won over all but the most fanatical Arians. Old insults and wrongs were now forgotten. City after city followed the example of Alexandria in this work of conciliation, until the whole church prepared herself for the coming persecutions under Valens, the emperor, and her final triumph over Arianism. This council, wrote St. Jerome a few years later, quote, snatched the whole world from the jaws of Satan. It has been called the crown of the career of St. Athanasius. Isn't that something? So St. Athanasius held a synod with all his bishops in Egypt, restating the Catholic faith and converting many of the less convinced Arians back to Catholicism. But the fanatical Arians stayed unconverted. So isn't that interesting? St. Jerome says, this synod of bishops held by St. Athanasius snatched the whole world from the jaws of Satan. Like Archbishop Lefebvre, consecrating the 4 bishops, snatched tradition from dying, snatched the Latin Mass, snatched the faith from being extinguished. If only those 4 had been faithful to the end like him. He brought it off none too soon. Julian the Apostate was furious when he learned that the enemy of the gods, as he called St. Athanasius, had been up to. The bishops had been recalled to be supervised, he said, not to officiate at their sees. He was especially angered because St. Athanasius, that contemptible little fellow, said to Julian the Apostate, had dared to baptize some Greek ladies of high rank in my reign, he said, and he ordered him out of Egypt by December 1st, 362. So, St. Athanasius, he didn't even spend a whole year. So, in the early part of 362, he comes back, and by December, he has to pack up and leave again for the 3rd exile. St. Athanasius left in good time on October 23rd, promising his friends that he would soon be back, and took a boat up the Nile River, intending to hide in the Thebaid desert until the storm blew over. Some distance up the river, he learned that the emperor's officers, angry at his escape from their hands, had left Alexandria, the city, in pursuit. So they saw on the river, the Nile River, the Julian soldiers were hunting down St. Athanasius. St. Athanasius commanded in his boat with the monks, turn around and go downstream. Some distance down the river, they passed a boat going upstream with imperial officers aboard. We are looking for the Bishop Athanasius, shouted one of them. Have you seen him? Keep right on going, replied St. Athanasius. He is not far off. The imperial rowers quickened their stroke in their boat. The hostile vessel disappeared, and St. Athanasius and his friends, the monks, finally made their way to the upper reaches of the mysterious river. As they approached Hermoupolis, a host of priests and monks came forth to welcome them on both banks of the river. The abbot Theodore set the fugitive on a donkey and then on foot escorted him to the monastery, while the brothers, as night fell, walked on either side with innumerable burning tapers, candles, that scattered sparks all around them. How are the brethren? Was the first question of St. Athanasius on arriving at the monastery. By your holy prayers, Father, we are well, replied Theodore the abbot. And so it proved when the visitor made one of his careful inspections. He went from monastery to monastery, his keen eye taking in everything until at midsummer, while at Antinopolis, he was obliged to bring the inspections to an abrupt end, hearing that the officers of Julian the Apostate were still seeking him, and that a party of them had been seen coming up the Nile River. The abbot Theodore hastily provided a covered boat. He and another very old and happy monk named Pammon, Pammon, hustled the holy bishops, St. Athanasius and his friends aboard the boat, and all started slowly upstream against the wind and the strong current, towed by brawny monks on either bank. So what a scene. These big tough monks carrying with ropes, pulling the boat up the river on either side of the banks. going against the stream and the winds. So St. Athanasius, yeah, look at it. He's hunted everywhere he goes. But he's friends with the monks, kind of like Archbishop Lefebvre. He was the father not only of the Society of St. Pius X priests, but the Dominicans, the Carmelites, the Benedictines sought refuge to him as a father. And I don't think there's any doubt that the Virgin Mary at La Salette referred to Archbishop Lefebvre when she said, "This prelate will rise up, dear to me and my son, who will preserve the faith, the priesthood, and will be a father."
Was it La Salette or Quito? Father?
Oh, I beg your pardon. It was Quito, Ecuador. Yeah, that's where it was. Sorry. Thanks for that. So, I mean, who else preserved the faith? At the end of the 20th century, it's very specific. Because even now, some society priests try to say it wasn't Archbishop Lefebvre.
It was Bishop Lefebvre.
Oh, brother, yeah. Yeah, right. So, all right, well, you see, here's this wild ride for St. Athanasius. And it's very similar to Archbishop Lefebvre. Very similar. And Archbishop Lefebvre in his 80s was traveling all over the world, 70s, giving confirmation, strengthening the faith, ordaining priests, preserving the tradition. He really was the Athanasius of our times, Archbishop Lefebvre. I'm sure they're having great talks in heaven. Great talks in heaven. And praying for us. And hopefully helping our own bishops of tradition. The pace was discouragingly slow. St. Athanasius for once seemed to be somewhat alarmed. At least old monk Pamon noticed that he was praying earnestly and made some encouraging remark. St. Athanasius replied that he was not afraid, that he never felt such peace of mind as when he was persecuted, and that it would be a great consolation to be killed for Christ's sake. So he had the spirit of a martyr. He was ready to die for the holy faith. The two abbots exchanged a smile. "You think me a coward, then?" said St. Athanasius, who had always felt a little touchy on the subject of his flights, even though he had justified them to his people. "Tell him why we smiled," said the abbot Theodore. "No, you tell him," replied the holy monk Pamon. "All right," said the abbot Theodore. "At this very hour, Julian the Apostate has been slain in Persia, for so God previously declared of him. The haughty man, the despiser, and the boaster shall finish nothing. And a Christian emperor shall arise, who shall be illustrious, but shall live only a short time. You need flee no longer to the Thebaid, but should secretly go to the court. And you will meet the new emperor on the way, and you will be treated kindly by him." Julian the Apostate died that very day and that very hour. The Galilean had conquered indeed, as he, capital H, as he always does. So there it is. Julian the Apostate went to dust, but the faith carries on. So it's a beautiful chapter in the church history. It looked like all was lost, the faith hanging on a thread, but it always revives. And that gives us a lot of great hope and courage in this crisis, because come what may, the faith will continue. And we just have the grace to profess it and hopefully die professing it. Adiutorium nostrum in nomine Domini.